everyone, Lu here. You know, I love my chaotic, obscure, artistic manga. DRCL Midnight Children, Rosen Maiden, and even A Girl on the Shore were some manga that I actually really enjoyed despite how obscure and hard to follow all of them are. Cut to about a month ago. I was doing my usual late night writing for my channel anyway, listening to other people's fantastic video essays when I came across a video discussing a manga called Homunculus. The channel was Tale Foundry, by the way, and I highly recommend the channel, especially their video on Metamorphosis, because it's easily my favorite analysis on the novel. Anyway, when someone writes about a manga or anime being extremely disturbing, this usually piques my interest when a lot of people have a very low threshold for disturbing. I mean, people call Black Butler and even Madoka Magica disturbing solely for their dark themes, which I wouldn't think so. Horrifying, yes, but I wouldn't say disturbing, based off of other shows I've seen both real and anime. So I had to satiate my own curiosity and read the manga for myself. Well, not as disturbing as the shit I've talked about on this channel before, Tokyo Red Hood. Oh boy, was it a damn roller coaster that I just had to talk about. Homunculus is a manga created by legendary mangaka Hideo Yamamoto from March 2003 to February 2011. I say legendary because he created the manga Ichi the Killer that was turned into a live-action movie that's kind of a cult classic among horror movie fans. I've never seen it, but I definitely plan to. Many were extremely mixed to this manga for including some pretty disgusting actions from the protagonist that I personally don't agree was necessary to see, but I do understand it was to show the depravity of the protagonist. While others highly praised it for showing the darker side of humanity and especially doing a fantastic job at showing a true narcissist through the eyes of supernatural visuals. I saw quite a few comments from different places online that the protagonist reminded them of an abusive ex-boyfriend or even an abusive family member like a father or uncle. Though keep in mind all of this comes from English perceptions of the manga, I have no idea what the Japanese manga community thinks of this manga. I do need to warn that this manga is not for people with certain triggers. If you are sensitive to or triggered by CSA, violence, gore, childhood trauma, gender dysphoria, beauty standards, parallels to real-life psychological abuse, and more that I'm honestly not sure what to call but I know bothers people, please do not read this manga or watch this video because I will be going over everything. Granted, my wording will be clean due to YouTube censorship over these topics, but I still want to warn. I also don't think I need to say it, but please don't read this manga or watch this video if you are under the age of 18. This is not a manga for children, and what I'm talking about is not something a child should be hearing, so if any, teenagers or something saw the title and got curious, please click away now. Anyway, let's take a look at this story for ourselves and see if this is worth the acclaim or if it's as artificial as the title. Story. We start our story with Susumu Nakoshi, a man seemingly down on his luck who lives in his car that's parked between an extremely fancy hotel and a park where all the homeless in the area live. We can see already he thinks he's better than the homeless people he hangs around with by saying to himself that he's not that low yet, as well as throwing up the food they give him when no one is looking. He's also kind of a weird guy anyway, where he understands his own car better than people, and he's able to tell how his car is doing just by pressing his ear to the steering wheel. He also sleeps in a fetal position sucking his thumb. No lie that even at the end of the manga, I can't seem to figure out why he sleeps sucking his thumb other than he's weird. I know there's a metaphorical reason, but I couldn't figure out that metaphor. Without much money left, he desperately needs money for gas for his own car, and his car is the one thing he cares about. That's when a person named Ito Manabu shows up with an offer that he'll receive 700,000 yen if Nakoshi allows Ito to conduct a trepanation on him. For context, a trepanation is when a hole is drilled into the skull. It's only used today to relieve pressure from severe brain injuries, but back in ye old times, it was one of the many random methods people thought would cure literally anything. Like how hundreds of years ago people thought just cutting someone would cure them of a cold. Ito is a medical student who wants to go further than just studying medicine and psychology, but study the very condition of humanity. For that, they believe they need to do a trepanation because it'll unlock the sixth sense. I keep saying they for Ito because later chapters kind of leave their gender into question, but I'm not there yet, so for now I'm gonna play it safe and just call Ito by they them. Nakoshi originally declines because who the fuck would say yes from a stranger in the park? However, he starts to change his mind because his car is towed. Getting a hole in his head, which is already making us question his sanity in the first place, even for all the money in the world, he originally didn't notice any differences in himself or the world around him until he ends up covering his eye during a card game with Ito. When covering his left eye, Nakoshi can see distorted versions of the people around him. Ito explains that maybe this is him hallucinating that he thinks are people's true hearts, or even the fake versions of people around him, so he calls them homunculus, as a homunculus in ancient mythologies are artificial humanoids. Or weird egg creatures, if you all remember that old viral video from that Russian guy on YouTube. While experimenting this strange new vision when he covers his eye, he is suddenly ambushed by Yakuza because he accidentally pissed one of them off by staring at them. This is when the Yakuza boss himself was ready to cut Nakoshi's pinky off, when Nakoshi sees the Yakuza as a little boy in a mech suit with a knife in the shape of a sickle. When he talks about this out loud, especially the sickle, it confuses and disturbs the Yakuza boss to leave him alone for now. He talks to Ito about it, who is both studying this and slowly becoming Nakoshi's unlikely friend. And Ito suggests maybe he's seeing some kind of trauma instead. He ends up meeting with the Yakuza again and manages to basically have the weirdest therapy session ever with him, where he confesses he accidentally severely injured his best friend with a sickle when they were harvesting rice or grain or whatever as kids for money. This gave him such a deep-seated guilt that he tried to be ruthless to hide the pain of the guilt of hurting his best friend, so that's why he takes people's pinkies to unhealthily relieve the guilt of cutting his best friend's pinky. Nakoshi's way of comforting him through this, or coercing him to spill his trauma, was by trauma dumping on him that his own childhood friend accidentally got hit by a car while they were playing on the street. Instead of calling for help, he ran away, and that somehow makes the Yakuza feel better to let out his pain. Because I guess he healed the boss's trauma, he looks normal now even when Nakoshi covers his eye and quits being a Yakuza boss, I guess. Where later he laughs at the Yakuza boss's trauma and ends up crying about his own. This to me sowed seeds that Nakoshi wasn't an entirely good person if he's gonna laugh at someone else's pain just to cry at his own. When we cut to another conversation of Ito and Nakoshi, it's a conversation going over theories as to why he may be seeing distortions of what it means for humanity as a whole. Are these distortions the ugly side of all people, or are these simply reactions people have to daily life? An example being that Nakoshi saw the distortion of a woman whose neck was shrunk down into herself as though to hide her neck. When Ito says something about necks being lovely out loud near the woman, suddenly her distortion showed that it looked like she had some kind of severe strangulation marks, even though she didn't have them in the real world. Ito did some digging later and found out the woman was abused by her ex-husband, and that's why her distortion shows her protective over her neck. It's essentially a manifestation of trauma or inner thoughts. Though he does wonder if some of these are showing how vile some people are, like people who think they can buy anybody off, or people who use others for personal gain. I should mention that he doesn't see everyone as a homunculus. About half of every room or space he's in shows homunculus and the other half are normal people. Ito suggests this might be that people are either really good at hiding their problems, even to themselves, or they just don't have any problems in the first place. Though I won't lie that there is a sexist viewing in this. Men in this series are seen in a more complex visual guide, while women, it's all about their bodies, appearance, who they're sleeping with. I'm not saying the author is sexist or anything. I think this is just purely just showing that Nakoshi thinks women only think about their appearance, their body count, and using people. When Nakoshi looks in the mirror as this conversation is kind of giving him existential dread, which mood, I gotta say, he sees he now has the robot arm from the Yakuza boss he talked to earlier. I can see a lot of answers for why people's trauma gets stuck on Nakoshi. Maybe for some, a traumatic bond can kind of remain a part of you. But for Nakoshi, it's hard to say because of how we see his true colors later. I think this is just him subconsciously claiming that person's trauma as his own, or even a trophy of conquest. In an attempt to see why he can see some people's homunculus and not others, Ito suggests they go to a Namesara place to see the homunculus of teenagers because teenagers are far more complicated than adults. For those who don't know, and this is one of those really disgusting things about Japan we all agree needs to get its shit together on, Namesara is essentially a place with a one-way mirror where men can pay to stare at teenage girls through this one-way mirror while teenage girls do suggestive poses in their school uniforms and sell their undergarments to men. It is so fucking disgusting, and I can't believe this is viewed in a positive light by some people in Japan, just because nothing explicit is happening to a child. I have never heard of this before this manga, but knowing it now is pretty damn gross. Though apparently after 2004, these places were given heavy restrictions and don't allow undergarments from people under the age of 18 to be sold anymore. I guess it's baby steps, but it's still disgusting. Anyway, Ito asks him to try and find a homunculus among these girls, and Nakoshi actually does. He sees a girl with the number 1775, later we find out her name is Yukari, is completely made of sand when he looks at her by covering his eye. The artwork with Yukari's sand form is actually really damn cool. It reminds me a lot of something Junji Ito would do, so I give him major props for the creativity. But the downside is that these two grown-ass adults are lusting after teenage girls as they try to figure out why she's sand. I mean, I think it's obvious why teenagers, especially teenage girls, don't understand themselves and feel pressured to be different things to different people in society, so she's sand so she can morph herself to be whatever people want her to be. Ito also pretty quickly comes to the same conclusion, but also realized she must be going through a rebellious phase to fit in a mold of society. They suggest that maybe she needs to break out of her routine or go further in her rebellion. Normal people, this would mean getting her caught for shoplifting, so maybe she sees that a rebellious choice has consequences, but instead Ito decides to take her on a date. It just made me so uncomfortable while Yukari goes alone with Ito, and honestly broke my heart to see her clinging to a teddy bear that she got at the arcade while this grown adult is pressuring her to try and force a therapy session on her. With Ito though, I am a little more inclined to forgive them for this entire thing because of some really complicated shit involving their gender identity crisis later. Basically, this scene is somewhat retconned later that they actually weren't lusting after a teenage girl. It's also because, thankfully, Ito didn't do anything as they, quote, chickened out when she called them on their bluff. Ito runs off, but unfortunately, Nakoshi finds her on the ground having a panic attack from the whole ordeal. He gives Yukari a ride home where he finally sees her sand in more detail. It turns out it's not sand, but actually teeny tiny words that speak about her insecurities. I thought this was actually really brilliant, showing that she's not trying to necessarily fit in a mold, but almost putting up a metaphorical wall of her own insecurities. Something that just really hits what it's like to be a teenage girl, and I actually really liked it. Inside, after Nakoshi instinctively drives to what I think is a seaside spot without knowing why, we cut back to Yukari, who is making up excuses for why she's home late that gives a better insight into her strict parents. Basically, I'm pretty sure it's like Mafia's home from Project Sekai, if anyone is familiar with that game. So when she gets inside the bathroom, we cut to Nakoshi, who is still really freaked out over his robot arm, until he finds Yukari's phone and reads her text messages like an asshole. He sees that she's been taking pictures of harming herself while also sending inappropriate messages to what I can hope and pray is not grown men, because I swear to gosh, I can hear the police sirens right now. Seeing the catch-up from harming herself, Nakoshi decides to prove he's not a robot man, so he decides now is the greatest time in the world to choke his chicken with his robot arm, while Yukari is hurting herself and enjoying the taste of her own ketchup. He, Nakoshi also likes eating his own, ranch dressing while hallucinating his life before being homeless, I guess? This sequence is so fucking weird, guys. I have no explanation for this shit. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, Nakoshi eating his own ranch dressing does feel like the mangaka's poorly disguised fetish, but maybe I'm just looking too far into it, or maybe I'm just used to manga having the author's weird fetish put into them. So after Yukari realizes that Nakoshi has her phone, she somehow texted her own phone to ask for her phone back. Nakoshi meets up with Yukari again and they end up having a drive and pretty heavy confrontation with her. He keeps his eyes closed half the time to yell about her homunculus while she's mainly confused, uncomfortable, and resorts to insulting and jabbing at hopes that maybe he'll kick her out of the car and leave her the fuck alone. I mean, if a stranger I never met started telling me that I was made out of sand and to stop all these crazy expressions when I'm not doing shit, I'd do anything to get out of the car too. After this drive around just to yell at a teenage girl, he parks in front of her house where he's fully going to commit assaulting her, believing that it'll make the sand go away. Because replacing one trauma for another is totally how this works, I guess. He then brags to her that he actually used to be super filthy rich who just waved money in front of women and they'd come flocking to him, as if that's supposed to make anyone feel better. He's just bragging about himself. However, he thinks that by assaulting her, she'll learn to use her body as a weapon and stop feeling so lost about herself. Like I said earlier, clearly Nakoshi doesn't view women in a positive light. If he thinks that the way to fix a teenage girl is by assaulting her and making her think she's only valued by her body, grade A protagonist we have here. I mean, I should clarify this now because media literacy is at an all-time low with TikTok and Twitter or anything to go by, that protagonist doesn't always mean a good person. Just look at characters like Dorian Gray, like Yagami, and even Eren Yeager to some extent. All protagonists who do shitty things and are terrible people, but are the protagonist. The protagonist just means the main character of the story. It has nothing to do with morals. Even the antagonist doesn't mean evil, it just means the character who is opposing the views and goals of the protagonist. So next time people clutch their pearls over a main character being shitty in a story, just remember that as humans we're allowed to write whatever the fuck we want even if we don't like it, and protagonist doesn't always mean a good person. Hell, this manga alone is a good study in how a protagonist isn't always morally correct. Despite telling him many times to stop and desperately trying to escape his grasp, Nakoshi assaults Yukari. This is definitely not consensual. She tells him multiple times to stop and keeps trying to escape. All the while, he makes this all about himself by telling himself that he's not her. He doesn't have an identity crisis because he knows who he is. We'll see how wrong he is about that later, but yeah, this is just... I knew this scene was going to happen going in because of the video I saw and had just hoped that maybe it was vaguely implied, but nope, this is very long and drawn out and I can't lie, was actually disturbing to see. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but assault scenes in media generally make me uncomfortable. This is just a hard scene to watch, even more when Nakoshi thought he fixed her because he assaulted her and got her own ketchup on her. I mean, I guess she stands up to her strict mom, but he's not fixing her or helping her because he, quote, made her a woman. He just gave her more issues he's too stupid to realize and just ruined a teenage girl's life. Karma comes to bite him though when his leg is now turned into sand, or the teeny tiny words of insecurity that Yukari had, so I guess he's starting to realize he's the insecure one here, but he's too full of himself to acknowledge it. After coming to this conclusion, I guess that he actually is directionless, he comes back to his job at the office where he quits. This is when we get a flashback that Nakoshi was a seemingly high-ranking office worker in finance? Look, Nakoshi is a pathological liar and I'm dumb, so I had a hard time figuring out what his job actually was, but I believe he worked in loans or in financing. In between those days of constant numbers and fake smiles, he'd eat his own ranch just to feel something, I guess? I don't know what the fuck you're getting from eating your own ranch, but we all can agree Nakoshi is fucking depraved, so whatever. He also leaves some ranch over his letter of resignation because he hated his job. It's not like his bosses or coworkers seem like bad people, so he just sounds like one of those dicks who's so narcissistic that they think they're above their peers for, quote, realizing we live in a society or whatever. I guess he feels better about the homeless people he hangs out with because he actually hangs out with them now and eats their food without throwing it back up. He even asks why they're homeless in the first place, where all of them confess it's because they got laid off and life basically shit on them, so they just kind of gave up on everything. It's actually really refreshing to see this manga really humanize those in poverty or homeless, just because I think it shows that even without status or wealth, we're all people and we're all still the same. Just like the homeless in the park have a community where they may be loud assholes, so do the rich in the hotel rooms across them. I don't know, I really like this parallel. Yeah, so Nakashi confesses he was an actuary for a life insurance company, but other people at the park point out that he's a pathological liar when it comes to confessing his job. So I really don't know what the fuck he did other than involving money and a lot of math. Which, to be fair, as someone who hates math, I too would quit my job and lose my mind where all I had to do all day is calculate numbers and shit. We then get a flashback to his extravagant life before becoming homeless and quitting his job, where he gave women expensive gifts and wowed them with his money. All of this while not actually feeling anything with these women. Even spicy times didn't feel like anything to him unless he got his ranch dressing on their faces. I guess because he can't feel or understand anything about people, he can hope that other people will tell him what he's like. Honestly, I feel like this is kind of a good parallel to real-life narcissists. They're constantly thinking of themselves so much that they end up panicking because they don't know how other people see them, all the while draining themselves of a real personality and emotions beyond thinking only about themselves. At least that's what I've gathered from interviews and videos online from people diagnosed with NPD. In this flashback, Nakashi confesses he works at a bank, so to me that shows he was fucking lying to people again. Anyway, his girlfriend at the time asks if he ever feels guilty about corporations that take out billion-dollar loans just to tank as hundreds or thousands of people lose their jobs, because he's the one doing the calculations and I guess making the final say if companies can continue paying off their loans or not. I'm not gonna pretend like I know how business stuff works, remember, I am very stupid. Anyway, so he doesn't feel guilty because why should he? He claims it's because it's basically murder he can commit because companies kill each other all the time and because no one dies, no one cares. It's basically him confessing that he doesn't care about other people. Except for one singular time he saw an old man sitting on a bench in the park looking over pictures in a photo album he had. Nakashi in the present asks about that old man where the guys say he used to hang out, but one day he stopped showing up at the bench and an awful smell came from his tent further in the back. Nakashi decides to investigate this because now is the time to find out what happened to that guy who made him actually feel some kind of guilt. Investigating the place gives him a flashback to why he knows this man at the park. It turns out he was someone Nakashi incidentally got laid off from his job when the company went under. Specifically one of the biggest corporations in Tokyo, where now he couldn't find work in Tokyo due to everyone recognizing him from a company that went under, so he went from making likely millions to just a humble taxi driver. Nakashi actually feels guilty he incidentally ruined this man's life, and just looking at him nearly brings him to tears. Cut back to the present and Nakashi is even more devastated that he ruined the man's life, who clearly had a very happy life and was a good man. He sees all his photos and how he lived with smiles, friends, and family. The man claimed he had a son that was looking out for him, but Nakashi puts two and two together that his son abandoned him and his own wife likely died, so that's how he ended up homeless in the park. I guess this kind of reinvigorates Nakashi to continue seeing people's homunculi to quote help them, so to speak, where he meets up with Ito again. Ito tells him that the experiment is done, but Nakashi isn't having it because he thinks this is just Ito running away from something again like he did with Yukari earlier. Because I'm a lover of suspense, I didn't say it, but Nakashi sees Ito's homunculus from the beginning as a person made entirely of water. This is beginning to bug Nakashi that his friend is made entirely out of water, and is trying to figure out what exactly is making Ito look this way to him. Ito tells him that this whole thing was a placebo effect and that they didn't actually think drilling a hole in someone's head would make them see people's hearts. It was just pure curiosity, and the rest they believe is just Nakashi both hallucinating and falling for a placebo effect. As the two are arguing if any of this is real or placebo, Nakashi notices that Ito is less made entirely out of water, but more so a guppy in a human-shaped fishbowl. Ito is shocked by this, claiming they purchased a guppy earlier today. This clearly goes deeper than Ito is letting on, but Nakashi knows the experiment is done and asks for Ito to plug up the hole in his head. They're about to when Nakashi sees Ito's face in his water form, and it's actually his father's, and their hands are shaking. This makes Ito stop the surgery for obvious reasons. Except Nakashi proposes that instead that Ito sew his eyes shut so he can see the homunculus at all times. As someone who is super grossed out and genuinely very squeamish by eye gore, yeah, this was not fun to read through, so I had to violently scroll away at this part. This basically leads to the weirdest half therapy, half confrontation scene I've ever seen, and I can't lie that it was visually fascinating though. Nakashi this entire time is trying to figure out why Ito is portrayed as a guppy and why their body is shaped like water. He keeps thinking about this over and over and starts to think maybe Ito is gay. Nakashi is thinking more the stereotype of a gay man in the mid-2000s when the manga was made, that gay men are extremely flamboyant and like pretty things. So he tries to kiss Ito, and while they do show that maybe they like men in some capacity, this isn't it either. As soon as Ito brings up gender dysphoria, that's when the fish inside of them gets bigger and they completely deflect the questions back at Nakashi instead of at themselves. I think this is supposed to tell us that clearly this has something to do with Ito and gender identity, but Nakashi can't quite realize that yet, so the two end up arguing again, where Ito drops a bombshell that Nakashi's current face was the result of plastic surgery. Given Ito is a pretty acclaimed medical student, they were able to put two and two together pretty quickly that Nakashi fixed his teeth, eyes, nose, and chin. Not only is this guy lying about his job, but even his damn face too. This leads to a really cool confrontation as the sun sets, which leaves Ito and Nakashi to continue arguing over the subject because Ito doesn't want to face their problem head on. However, this goes wrong when Nakashi starts hallucinating his old self rather than hearing Ito's actual words. As we were only given pieces of this, but Nakashi's dialect is even fake. If I'm gathering this right, he used to speak in a rougher dialect of Japanese associated with rebellious country boys, but the translation localized this in English to be something of a southern accent to kind of give an equivalency type of understanding. Honestly, this whole scene is so cool, and I actually love that you can't tell which one is the real Nakashi beyond a single manner of speech. As soon as Nakashi sees just a glimpse of what was once his real face, which he doesn't remember because I guess he was so ugly he trauma blocked it, he undoes the stitches on his eye to see real people again. After the two hug and apologize, with Nakashi relieved to see real people again, he calmly tells Ito that they're actually not so different after all, that the both of them have their own body issues. For Nakashi it was his looks because he used to be super ugly, and for Ito it clearly has something to do with their gender. Then comes kind of a sweet moment where Ito has to leave to see their dad, where Nakashi offers them a ride. Ito tells them that they thought they didn't like strangers in his car, but Nakashi says that Ito isn't a stranger, which I thought was kind of sweet to show that Ito really is a good friend to him. I mean, Nakashi is still an asshole and a piece of shit, but still. Ito visits their dad, and their dad confronts them on why they're suddenly interested in plastic surgery, as he thinks it's weird when Ito is studying medicine, not plastic surgery. This is clearly part of the gender dysphoria issue Ito is dealing with, but they smooth it over with their dad pretty quickly by saying it's merely studying reconstruction after accidents. They then switch the subject to say their dad's hospital room should have a guppy in there to liven up the place, where it shakes Ito's dad to show something clearly happened with Ito and a pretty fish. Nakushi comes to the same thought process when he's out by the ocean side he loves so much, and realizes finally what Ito's issue is. It isn't because they're gay or cross-dresser, but something much deeper and harder to come to terms with in Japan. So they take Ito to a fancy hotel and bought expensive-ass women's clothing and makeup for them. They finally get the image that the fish inside of Ito is actually a woman, and it's here we're finally confirmed Ito is clearly trans in some capacity. I can't sit here and say Ito is 100% a trans woman because they are only seen dressing up as a woman for largely special occasions, unless Ito is very slowly accepting their identity, or Ito could be gender fluid or even non-binary, both of which fall under the trans category from both my research as well as several close friends who identify as gender fluid or non-binary. So Nakushi decides to help Ito look like their inner true self, and even shames Ito for saying this is just drag when it's clearly deeper. Something about this is kind of sweet though. Nakushi sits there and slowly applies makeup on Ito, where their true self becomes clearer and clearer with every step of the makeup process he adds on them. This whole thing is also to explain that Ito never actually wanted to do anything with Yukari at all. They just used toxic masculinity as a front to make it sound like they wanted to do something with her, but the truth was that Ito just wanted to look like or superimpose on her rather than do anything with her. Like how teenage girls will see a model and want to be that model just to look pretty rather than like do anything with that model. But this isn't to say Ito is 100% redeemed to me. I mean, I know they did put a hole in a guy's head as part of a really damn unethical experiment, and while no one died, you know, that's still not cool, but I mean, they're better than Nakushi to me. Ito then has a night out with Nakushi as Ito slowly embraces their femininity, while Nakushi's sight doesn't show them as a homunculus anymore. During this conversation, Nakushi tells Ito to just be themselves and that their only opinion of who they are should matter rather than if anyone else sees them as a man, woman, neither, or in between. However, Ito is curious on why Nakushi threw away his old face, where Nakushi legit can't remember what he used to look like before the plastic surgery. Even memories of when he was a child is with his post-surgery face rather than when he was an ugly barnacle. As well as Ito claiming that he's doing all this for their sake but to fuel Nakushi's own ego and trauma instead. This is when Nakushi asks about the guppy again then, because he doesn't remember having a guppy, so it must clearly belong to Ito, but Ito denies this fully, but we can tell this is suppression on Ito's part too, because they clearly don't remember having a guppy in the first place. However, it hits him that Ito is both speaking in a more feminine speech and using Nakushi to confess their homunculus was that way. Basically that Ito has a very strict father who wants a son, while Ito feels like they just want to be a beautiful woman on the inside, like how the guppy looked from their childhood that their father killed. I don't think Ito 100% believes this was their childhood, but instead Nakushi's, basically deflecting hardcore because of denial. While Nakushi starts getting irritated about this, realizing that even Ito has warmth and is stinky to him, while Nakushi realizes he doesn't have any warmth or smell to him. He describes earlier in this made-up lyrics that he likes to make that basically he feels like he's wrapped in saran wrap, basically. He ends up falling into his old speech pattern, which freaks the fuck out of Ito. So Ito then leaves to go powder their nose. When looking in the mirror though, Ito feels a sense of deep relief and metaphorically lets the fish out of themselves. They realize they're a beautiful woman, and I think that's just really sweet. Later at the hospital with their father, Ito finds childhood photos from when they were really young that they thought were lost, where they find out they actually did have a childhood pet guppy that their father really did kill. The reason is that Ito was dressing in women's clothing to mimic the beautiful flowy tail of the guppy, and not wanting their child to be a woman or trans or gender fluid or whatever, Ito's father basically killed the fish. Ito was absolutely devastated beyond belief, and trauma suppressed it until their father told them in the present about the poor fish. They also swallowed the fish when it died, so Maybe that might be why Ito manifested the fish inside of their subconscious. That's kind of weird, but okay. Back to Nakoshi. He's now making Ito's own identity issues about himself now by realizing he doesn't remember his face pre-surgery and that his feet don't stink, which means he isn't alive and no one is looking at him. He then starts to think about how he just wants people to look at him, the real him, without realizing he's a self-centered dick. Anyway, so he remembers that there was one woman who actually looked at him for real for who he was as well, and starts comparing himself to a noperabo, which is a faceless ghost in Japanese urban legends. For those who grew up with Monster High like I did, that's basically what the character Kiyomi Haunterly was supposed to be. Ito and Nakoshi talk about this later, which Ito says they finally understand their father and asks Nakoshi about the status of their homunculi, where Nakoshi can still see Ito isn't 100% there yet as a person, but is close to being their true self. Seen when Nakoshi can see that Ito secretly wants implants to present a more feminine appearance and suggests Ito should have cosmetic surgery. What was sweet was when he said that Ito will still work through it little by little. A sweet message to me that being a trans woman or man is not something you transition to overnight. It takes a lot of coming to terms with yourself and a lot of big steps. Nakoshi then confesses that he changed his face so people would notice him, because he was tired of living day by day with nothing happening and no one noticing him. The only person who gave him the time of day and could see the hearts of people the way he could was a woman whose face he can't remember anymore. A bigger problem comes when he can no longer see Homunculus anymore, and it sends him into a panic because for him, the Homunculus was his way of seeing real people, and the real world was nothing more than a fake vision for him. Although Ito tries to help by reopening the hole, the bone had not closed yet. It was just the skin tissue healing and getting slightly infected, so Ito simply reopened the skin for him. It doesn't return Nakoshi's ability back to him. This kind of does call into question if all of this was just Nakoshi hallucinating via a placebo effect, and if anything he saw was real at all. Considering he was hallucinating these homunculus talking to him when the real-life person wasn't saying anything at all, maybe a part of it is in his head. However, this changes when Nakoshi can only see one homunculus, and it's a woman he doesn't recognize, whose face keeps changing to all the women he's slept with before throughout his life. Nakoshi thinks this is fucking weird and decides he needs a new hole in his head by Ito, but they won't do it because that's clearly too dangerous. As a side note, by the way, Ito's father is accepting them for who they are now, and I think that's really sweet. Anyway, Nakoshi steals Ito's trepanation equipment, and now he's gonna do it on himself like a fucking lunatic. Even worse, he uses a bigger medical drill because he thinks that'll work better. Like, what? Okay, so after that mess with a chilling picture to show he can see Homunculus again, he ends up nearly passing out in the park from unchecked blood loss. He then meets that mysterious shape-shifting lady again, and she hints that they go further back than some office party, as Nakoshi keeps trying to dream of this mysterious girl's face, where this lady's face now morphs into that famous meme we've all seen used in like Japanese creepypasta. Which, fun fact, is currently a mission in the lost media community to find the origin of that image's pieces, so who knows, maybe this manga is a good timeline to see how far back this image goes. The woman from earlier helps him sit down, but Nakoshi sees that she's more like a noperabo than he feels he is, where he then gets a flashback to where he thinks he might have met her at an office party. He explains to Ito a few days later that Nanako, the woman he remembers as the only one who saw him for him, could see homunculus and that she would show it by sketching what she thought was people's hearts. But it wasn't always accurate. An example that she saw a girl as a wilting flower, which made her think this girl's grandfather was assaulting her, but when Nanako tried to step in when she saw the girl crying, it turns out Mother Nature paid her an early visit and her grandfather wasn't hurting her at all. I think this is meant to show that people who can see hearts are superimposing their own assumptions on someone at first glance rather than actually seeing someone's true problem. Like how Nakoshi will see a short guy and assume he wants to be super tall just because he's short without ever asking or thinking that maybe some people who have their shit together don't really think that way, as opposed to himself. When he's at her house, he keeps asking if maybe they did the do together and that's why he feels weird about her, but he gets flashbacks showing that she actually refused to do the do with him and instead drew a picture of him while he was sleeping that showed his true face, which was him, but his face was blacked out like an opera ball, just as he's seeing her right now. It hits him that she really is Nanako, and he discovers that she has a shopping addiction now, where she kicks him out for obvious reasons. He goes to his seaside spot again and realizes that the reason he loves this place so much is because this is where he and Nanako first kissed. Ito tries to tell him that he should work on his own shit instead of thinking Nanako is his answer for his own issues, but Nakoshi being Nakoshi, he wants to use other people as his own therapist, so he ends up meeting with Nanako for another confrontation. Each time her face changes, it's a lie, and Nakoshi ends up admitting to her that he got plastic surgery because he hated how ugly he was. A particular point was when his father admitted to someone else in front of him that yes, he was ugly, and it broke Nakoshi so much that he viewed his father as dead to him, which is why he tells everyone that his father died when he was young. It's funny how he keeps calling everyone else liars and fakes when he is clearly the one who has been lying and faking the entire time. To me, it shows he genuinely does not care about the people around him, but more so about himself and how he feels more than anything else. Nanako actually calls him out on this and how he wants people to see his heart, or claims that he can see people's heart, but can he really? He always keeps talking on about himself and only views women on a superficial level, so how can he claim he can see hearts when all he wants to look at is just the surface? As he finally fucking listens to her, he starts to see the indention of his old face in her, which causes her to run away from him as soon as he points it out to her. Meanwhile, the homeless people at the park are getting kicked out and sent to low-income homes, so the park doesn't end up a homeless encampment next to this expensive-ass hotel. This ends up with one of the homeless men basically shutting down in their tent. Nakoshi this entire time has seen this particular man as a silver egg, and so he decides he's gonna solve this mystery even when it's very clear this man isn't in the right mindset for a therapy session right now. He ends up getting the guy to open up, only for this man to realize he used to be so happy and normal until his wife died and he ended up struggling deeply as a single father because of his grief. He ended up becoming an alcoholic from the grief, and a really violent one at that, where he ended up in a knife fight and stabbed a guy in the arm. Considering it's kind of illegal to stab someone, he ended up in prison for a year and ended up way too afraid to be a chef again because of the stabbing. After losing his career, he abandoned his daughter and fell so deep into alcohol that he lost everything and became the homeless man we've been seeing since the start of the manga. Nakoshi calls him the fuck out for abandoning his daughter, but he really isn't someone to talk, as seen when he makes this all about him again to talk about how he abandoned Nanako. Helping this man realize he abandoned his daughter but still had a place to go now makes an eggshell manifest on Nakoshi's head. This makes Ito theorize what I said earlier about this being an ego trophy for Nakoshi, realizing slowly that Nakoshi is way more selfish than he's even letting on the outside, where Nakoshi also finds out that the man he tried to help ended up taking his own life out of grief for abandoning his daughter. This really spells it out to everyone reading, beyond Yukari earlier, that Nakoshi is not helping anyone. I'm not saying he had to stay that way in his addiction and shell, but is Nakoshi really the kind of guy capable and trustworthy enough to help someone clearly suffering from addiction and mental health struggles? Considering his helping was just shaming him for abandoning his daughter and making him feel worse about himself. The same goes for Yukari. Yes, she's a lost teenager, but assaulting her while he yells about his own issues isn't helping her. Clearly this shows that Nakoshi is just making things worse for other people in a path of destruction to fuel his own ego like a real narcissist would. After Nanako asks for a ride and to sleep in his car for the night, another confrontation happens where he tells her the full truth about his homunculus abilities, where that indentation of his real face freaks him out again and causes him to slam on the brakes of the car. He tells her she's nothing but a liar who ran away from the only person who could see her for her, but she tells him the same thing. In this question, he finally remembers his real face and Nanako's real face, because I completely forgot to mention that Nanako got plastic surgery too, for obvious reasons, as she continuously asked why he left her. She was also pregnant with Nakoshi's baby. We're never given information if she deleted her pregnancy or not. I couldn't really find an answer if deleted pregnancies are fully legal or not in Japan, because I kept getting highly contradictory answers on that, but I think she did? They get back in the car where he says, again, that he was tired of looking ugly and tired of days going by where he was practically invisible, so he planned for plastic surgery and broke up with Nanako on Christmas because he didn't want to spend Christmas with an ugly girl. Okay, is it me or does this sound like something from an Am I the Asshole Reddit thread? Anyway, Nanako also says that he left her even after she told him she was pregnant with their child, which apparently gave him more reasons to leave because he couldn't stand the idea of looking at a tiny version of his ugly face again, as he left to find a place he could, quote, belong. In reality, he was directionless and didn't know where he needed to go until he found Nanako again, where he asks her to look at his heart again. Before, she pictured him as pure white clouds, but now, when she does picture his heart, she sees nothing but an oni, and like any sane person, flees the fuck away from him. Her Yakuza sugar daddy finds her because she stole a fuck ton of money, where Nakoshi talks him down by having a therapy session identical to the one he had with the Yakuza from way earlier in the beginning. This scares the fuck out of Nanako that he can actually see people's hearts, and finally caves to be with him again, wishing to see Nakoshi's heart again. This gives Nakoshi a horrifying idea to trepanate Nanako. Completely drinking his Kool-Aid, she lets him drill into her skull, but I'm gonna be honest that I think he killed her with this because the end implies that she died from him doing this to her. After the attempt, she doesn't see anything, but Nakoshi starts seeing his face on her. I was super confused for why this was the case, and I do admit I cheated a little and read online on old forums and Reddit over a decade ago about why the fuck he was seeing his face on her, and this was basically his subconscious thinking he's fixing her by making her exactly like him, which is actually a pretty smart way to parallel what it must feel like to be in an abusive relationship with someone so damn full of themselves like Nakoshi. So, despite Nanako looking exactly like him, he boinks her even while looking exactly like him. Because remember guys, Nakoshi is a 100% normal guy. However, as Nakoshi boinks her, Nanako starts to see that Nakoshi looks just like her, where she says this isn't right and passes out, though I'm pretty sure she dies by the looks of it. After he gets kicked out of the fancy restaurant to grab a bite, he sees a couple arguing and his homunculus vision sees them all as himself, where he steps in to try and help them because of his ego. For some reason, seeing everyone looks exactly like him makes Nakoshi really damn happy, but to me this is honestly horrifying to see that basically killing someone he loved in the past and manipulated into trying to be the same person she was before finally made him happy. 1 year later, Nakoshi lives by the beach in his car now with an eye patch, so he always sees Homunculus. Ito shows up and has been looking for him for over a year. I'm not sure if Ito has fully transitioned at this point, but she tells him that she feels so sorry for doing all this to him in the first place. Nakoshi shows her that he's drilled way more holes into his skull like a madman, and even attempts to drill a hole in Ito's skull before the police show up. I guess Ito was an informant to lure out Nakoshi because he's clearly wanted for Nanako's murder. Nakoshi waves to the police happily, where it's assumed he's arrested for her murder and hopefully the other crimes he committed, like assaulting a teenage girl. There, the manga ends. This manga was a wild fucking ride, but I can't lie, it does have some deep themes about empathy, ego, trauma, toxic beauty standards, gender, and human nature. I can't really say it was all well executed to me, especially the theme of gender identity with Ito, mostly because it's so vague and older translations online do add some slurs in later on that I feel is kind of a one step forward, two steps back kind of deal. It's not the most perfect trans story out there in anime and manga, but for a manga made in the mid-2000s to early 2010s, it's not a terrible trans story either. I would have preferred if the manga was a little more obvious, but I have to remember that LGBTQ+ topics are still very new to portraying a positive and non-fetishized light in Japan. Though I have to admit, when I was reading this manga, I was reminded of a lot of work, so I wonder if any were an inspiration. Specifically, I was reminded of No Longer Human, Junji Ito, and even American Psycho to some extent. It's a very interesting story though, and I like to see stories that focus on horrible people. As much as I love good triumphing over evil like every other person, sometimes it's fascinating to sit down and see the psyche of a person that's just the complete opposite of you in every way, even if they're a dog shit person, you know? I'd say the story is good, even if it's often disturbing or sometimes hard to read.
Artwork.
If there is one thing I want to massively praise Hideo Yamamoto for, it's his artwork. This man's art style is genuinely very impressive. He's not Kentaro Miura or Sakamoto Shinichi to me, who I think are some of the best manga artists of all time, but I think his artwork is extremely impressive. I mean, this guy can make almost photorealistic people when it comes to background characters, and his semi-realistic art style with main characters blend in very well. His backdrops and character design also blend in very well. I feel like he's really good at capturing a particular time in the world through his artwork. Specifically, his artwork feels like a real time capsule of the styles and aesthetics of the late 90s to early 2000s culture. He's also really damn good at creating a surreal environment where you honestly can't tell what's real and what's not in this manga, and I think that's great, considering this manga narratively plays if Nakoshi was actually seeing people's hearts or just hallucinating. Every mangaka has their own way of bending the medium of a manga to their will, like Sakamoto Shinichi using the flow of turning the page to create a melodramatic scene, or Junji Ito using the slow burn of turning the page to build tension for a jump scare on the next page. In this case, Hideo Yamamoto's way to bend the medium was mastering the black, white, and gray colors at his disposal to their limit. He plays with shadows the most, and I think it's genuinely very inspiring how well he's mastered using black the most, considering, at least to me as an artist, black is very hard to work with. Though I do have to give some negatives that he does reference memes a couple of times, which does break the tension a couple of times. Specifically, I thought using the creepypasta face was pretty damn cheap, and there was that one laughing guy meme in there too that I couldn't find what page it happens on, but when going through the manga for a bit to gather pictures, I did notice it and I forgot to save it, so whoops. Overall, despite my critiques, I think his artwork is actually pretty damn good. Even if you're not here for the story, at least the artwork is pretty fantastic to look at.
Final thoughts.
Does this manga feature problematic work? Yes. Does it feature a brilliant side story of a trans character? No. Is it still enjoyable despite its problematic content? Absolutely. I always believe you can enjoy something even if it has content you particularly find disgusting or maybe other people do. I do really like stories that break down and show you the dark truth of someone with abusive behavior or someone suffering with a specific disorder, because it's fascinating to watch psychological stories. I mean, my favorite video game is Silent Hill 2, so I think that says a lot that I love psychological horror and character studies. This isn't a manga I can recommend to every person I meet like I do with Innocent, mostly because of the very heavy themes, and I know not everyone likes to watch those heavy themes. But if you can handle it, then I absolutely recommend this manga. This actually has me curious to read Ichi the Killer or watch the movie, although I hear that one is extremely violent and gory, so I may need to hype myself up for that one when throat and eye gore in particular give me the ick. Anyway, you guys let me know down below what you think. Will you check out this manga? Are there any I should check out? As always, let me know down below. Hey guys, thanks for watching! If you liked the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you're new. If any of you would like to help support my channel in any possible way, my Ko-fi page is down below in the description, along with all of my social media. For any subscribers, new or old, who'd like to help with video ideas, or maybe just want to talk about anime or something, I have a fan server linked down below. See you next time!